Hello Year 11 and welcome to your next geography lesson. In today's lesson we are looking at the theory of plate tectonics. So last week we started to look at the structure of the Earth and we looked at the different characteristics of the inner core, the outer core, the mantle and the crust. And then we started to describe the location of earthquakes and volcanoes. So this week we're going to be looking at why plates move, where is the evidence that plates have moved and are moving, and then we're going to look at the 4 plate boundaries. So in today's lesson we're looking at plate tectonics and then we're going to talk about the theory that Wegener put together. So this is where we are. We're looking at number 3 now, plate boundaries. Okay then, so task 1 for today's work, so make sure you have open either the PDF or the Word document that I have put together. For task 1, you have to describe how the plates have moved between 980 MA and 5 MA. Let me just see if this will play for me. So if you see here, we have a total shift in the land. So 250 million years ago, the land masses of Earth were all clustered into one supercontinent. And as this video goes through time, you'll notice that these plates are constantly moving. Pangaea has broke apart, so the supercontinent used to be called Pangaea, and Pangaea moved apart, and as the supercontinent moved apart, all of these land pieces slowly moved away from each other. So now you can see what Earth looks like, okay? Now it's very clear that Earth from that video has changed significantly. And, you know, we hear a lot about the fact that Iceland is getting bigger every single year because of the plate boundary that it lies on. And there's lots of evidence to show that the plates are moving either away from each other or towards each other. Like, for instance, Mount Everest in Nepal, that gets higher every single year because 2 plates are pushing towards each other. So that video is a very quick one to show you what has happened over time. So for task 1, you need to just simply describe over the millions of years how it's changed. And then for task 2, we're going to look at this in a little bit more depth. So, 220 million years ago, there was a supercontinent called Pangaea. So you can see here. Now, the reason it was a supercontinent is because it was simply one continent. And if you actually look very carefully, you can see that this here is Africa. We've got South America here, North America here, and then this here is kind of a mesh up of Asia and Europe. So what happened next? Well, 20 million years later, so 200 million years ago, you can see that there are now 2 larger continents. So we've had a shift from Pangaea to 2 larger continents. So they're slowly moving away from each other. And then 65 million years later, so 135 million years ago, there hasn't really been much change, except for maybe here you can see that this continent is kind of shifting away. It's separate now from this larger continent, whereas North America and Europe and Asia all seem to be combined. 65 million years ago, you can see that the plates are all starting to shift away from each other. So we've now had a breakup of Africa and South America, but yet South America and Antarctica are still combined here. And you can see that North America is still holding on with a thread to Europe and to Asia. And then we have present day. So if you actually look carefully, we've had a conjoining. So North America and South America are now attached. Asia and Africa are still combined here through what we would call now as the Middle East. And Antarctica has shifted much further south than the rest of the continents. So it's pretty obvious that from these images we had a supercontinent. Now, Alfred Wegener had a theory about continental drift, and that these supercontinents, there used to be one and they moved slowly apart. Now you can imagine if anyone came up with this theory and they had no evidence to back it up, they would be laughed at. They'd be deemed crazy unless they had evidence to prove it. And you know, it wasn't until the 1950s that his hypothesis and his theory was widely rejected, and everybody involved in geology just thought he was crazy. So he needed research. So what did he discover? Well, if we look at photo 1, we can see that all of the pieces are like a jigsaw. So in this image here in present day, it's obvious that actually South America near Brazil would slot into this area here where we find Nigeria. It's very clear that this part of North America would slot into this gap here, okay? And you can see slowly how actually they would start to come together. So this gap here in Antarctica could fit into that piece there in South Africa. So he had the idea that all of the continents would fit together like a jigsaw. So they were like interlocking pieces of a jigsaw. But that still wasn't enough. He had to prove that they were once combined. So yeah, they jigsawed together. Well, that could just be luck. So what evidence was there to prove that they were once together? Well, in South Africa and South America, two continents that used to be combined, there were fossil evidence of a reptile, so an ancient reptile fossil was found, and it was found in both continents. Now this reptile was known as the Mesaurus. It can't swim. So this reptile cannot swim. And it also, there's other layers to it. It can't swim in salty water. It can't swim long distances. So they had to have been joined at one part. So they had to have been joined. And this reptile must have been able to walk between the two bits of land. So that's our first bit of evidence using fossils to prove that they were together. Now, what else was there? Well, there were also plant and animals fossils found in India, so India where we have here, that were similar to things found in Australasia. Now, if we actually look back to here, 200 million years ago, India and Australasia were very close together. So we had plants and animal fossils that were very, very similar, which suggests that at once they were connected. So this was the evidence that these two plate boundaries, and they were all once connected through Pangaea. So we've seen how Earth has changed over time, we've got evidence to back it up, and now we need to know how Earth changes over time. So this leads us on nicely to look at convection currents. So what are convection currents? Well, convection currents are movements that happen in the mantle that encourage plates to move either away from each other or towards each other. So how does this work? Well, for task 4, you need to create a similar diagram to mine and annotate it, making sure that you include all of the keywords that are below. Okay, so you might want to write your title, Convection Currents. Okay, so first of all, we need to add on the inner core. Now, the inner core is known as being as hot as the sun. So it's roughly 3,800 degrees C. And what happens? Well, if you think about if you're in a shower or if you're cooking something or when you put the radiators on, all of that heat rises. So the heat from the inner core rises, and it rises through the outer core, and it makes its way into the mantle. Now I'm just changing my colour to more of an orange colour to show that it's still hot, but it is not as hot as it was when it was in the inner core. So this heat has risen, and as it's risen, that is the reason why the material in the mantle is quite viscousy. So I'm just going to draw on my mantle layer. So this is the mantle. So all of the material within the mantle, we've got hot, molten magma. So it's quite fluid, which means that it will easily move. So as the heat rises into that hot molten magma in the mantle, it's going to be able to start to move the things within that. So as the heat rises, it's going to force up with it any molten magma. However, as it gets closer to the crust, remember that the crust is where we are closest to. So the crust layer is relatively cool. So as this hot molten magma reaches the crust, it starts to cool down. Now, if heat rises, that means that cold things sink. So as the molten magma gets closer to the crust, it starts to harden, cool, and then it sinks. Now, you can imagine as it sinks, it's moving back further down towards the bottom half of the mantle, which means that it will start to warm up again. Now, as it warms up, it will start to melt. So as it sinks, the magma melts again and becomes viscousy again. Okay? And then the same thing occurs. So as it melts and it gets hotter, it's then broken down, it's warmer, so then it will start to rise again. So you can see here we have this circular motion of convection currents, and the same thing happens the whole way along in the mantle. So it rises. As it rises, it starts to cool. As it cools, it hardens and then sinks again, and then as it sinks, it gets warmer again, melts, and then it rises again. So this is what we call the convection currents. So convections, you think of heat, and currents, you think of circles. So convection means heat, and currents means they're moving in like a circular motion. So now we know why this is happening. So heat from the inner core rises into the mantle. As it moves into the mantle, it melts all of the stuff within this into a hot molten magma. It then rises. As it rises and gets closer to the crust, it cools and condenses. It cools, it sinks, it melts again, it rises, it cools, hardens, melts again, and then the same thing happens over and over again. Now, what we will start to notice is that in some parts, if I draw on two little circles here. So what we'll notice is that if these circles are moving in separate ways, so if one convection current is moving this way and one convection current is moving this way, well, this is going to start to create fractures in the Earth's crust, because the Earth's crust will be moved in this direction, but then this Earth crust will be moved in this direction, so these plates will move away from each other. Now, if the plates are moving away from each other, this allows cracks in the Earth to form. Now, if a crack forms in the Earth, oh, where's that gone? If a crack forms in the Earth, then this molten magma can escape. So as plates move away from each other, we have volcanoes forming. Now, if the two plates are moving towards each other, so for the sake of this, let's remove these arrows here, and let's put them going in the same direction. So if these two convection currents are moving towards each other, then they're going to be converging. Now, as they converge, the two plates will move closer towards each other. So they'll move closer and closer until eventually they bump into each other. And this will lead to earthquakes. So there'll be fractures. As they meet, there'll be lots of friction. They'll start to grind against each other because the convection currents will still be moving in that circular motion. They'll still be going round. This one will still be going round, so they'll be forced towards each other, and that will lead to earthquakes. Now, these can be two types of plate boundaries. They can be pushed upwards to make fold mountains like we have in Mount Everest, or they can also, one can be forced upwards to form volcanoes, and one can be forced down where it sinks. However, we're going to be looking at that in more detail in the next lesson. So what you need to do from this task is to use this diagram to help you, and you also need to include all of these keywords on the side to make sure you know what happens during convection currents. Once you have done that, you then need to show me what you know. So here is a diagram that I've drawn, and there's lots of problems wrong with it. So you need to spot the 4 mistakes on my diagram. You might want to correct them, and then you need to answer these questions. Now, remember that when you're watching this video, you might choose to watch it in sections. So you watch task 1, then complete task 1, and then you watch task 2 and then complete task 2, or you can watch it all and then complete the tasks afterwards. If you still have any questions, please send me a message and make sure that you submit your work after the lesson is complete.